How much time do you spend working on the culture of your organization? And everybody will say not enough. Well, how much time is that? Well, an hour or two a week. And they're thinking about a time that they sat and talked about culture. My answer to them is every minute of every day, you're building the culture of your organization. Not by what you say, but by what you do. I remember one time we did a video about this, about Eddie's yellow folder. And Eddie came back from a team meeting one time and he talked to me and he said, John, I just went to a team meeting. Everybody's got a folder on me except me.
Wow.
And they won't let me look at what's in the folder.
Wow.
This DSP is coming on and she says, I had a terrible week. I just had a terrible week. I deserve this big piece of pizza. And she's got a big slice. And then a young man with a disability comes in and says, I had a terrible week too, picks up a big slice and says, I deserve a piece of pizza too. And the staff person takes it away and says, no, your behavior plan says you don't get pizza unless you have a good week. Now think of the irony of that, right? You know? And so how do we transform this world we live in now that is very much a culture of compliance and control into one that turns people around and listens to them?
Welcome to IDD Leader, where human services leaders grow their impact, lead with heart, and build the workplaces our field deserves. I'm your host, Nate Beers. Let's dive in. Do you ever feel like parts of your organization have just slipped into what we might call compliance mode? Maybe turnover's high. Maybe your supervisors are stretched super thin, and you're just trying to make sure everything is where it needs to be and everybody's where they need to be. If you're resonating with that, I've got some good news. My guest today is John Dickerson. He's the founder of MyQuillo and the host of MyQuillo podcast. He is a wealth of knowledge and experience, a longtime veteran in our field, and not to mention, he's an awesome storyteller. So today's conversation is part 1 of 2. It's filled with story after story of making sure the heart of the matter stays at the heart of what we're doing on a daily and weekly basis. I think you're going to love it. So without further ado, enjoy today's conversation. Well, John, most IDD providers that I talk with are fighting some of the same battles. They've got high turnover, supervisors are stretched thin, and their culture often feels more about compliance than connection, not how they intend for it to be, but how it turns out. So from where you sit, what's really at the heart of that problem?
Well, I think that's a really insightful question, Nate, because it's, I've been at this for a long time. And I think, each year somebody says, well, it's never been this tough. Well, I don't know if that's true, but it certainly is difficult at any time right now. On one hand, we have increased regulation, which deals with compliance, which puts more stress on the communication that goes within the agency. It's all about compliance, record keeping, data recording, and very little about the relationship between the individual and the person they support, and the relationship between the supervisor and the person, and the mission of the entire organization. It seems to be driven by this communication that is all about compliance, what to do, what not to do in order to not get fired or get written up. And that's incredible culture to try to then work within.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm excited to take a deeper dive into some of that because I know that you've been doing work along those lines. But before we put the cart in front of the horse, why don't you introduce yourself to any listeners that might not be familiar with you? Maybe you could feel free to share a little bit about your journey. I know you did decades. I think it was at the ARC, if I'm not mistaken. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And then last time we talked, you said that you, quote, failed retirement. And now all of a sudden we have MyQuillo. So do tell us your current role there and kind of what that's about as well.
Well, I tell people I went to college to learn to be a teacher, play football, and coach football. That was my goal in life. And I graduated in 1973. I had met my wife, and we were starting to look for jobs. And our agreement was whoever found a job first, that's where we're going to move. We were from a little town in South Dakota. And there weren't a lot of teaching jobs. So one of my coaches was the first special ed professor in the state of South Dakota, and he steered me towards the arc. Um, and that started a career in 1973 that carried me all the way through 2015. First with the Arc of South Dakota, the Arc of Indiana, the Arc of the United States, and then the last 32 years of it as executive director of the Arc of Indiana as a lobbyist, organizer, and advocate within the system. 2015, I lost my mind, retired early, ran for public office, did not win, and then started looking around as too young to not do anything, and knew we had to find a different way to engage, support, and work with staff, people with disabilities, and families. And so we developed Quillo, a micro-learning site all designed around positive relationships and positive psychology.
Hmm. Okay, so tell us a little bit more. How does Quillo work, or who's it for?
Well, we have actually two different versions. One is Quillo Connect, which is, excuse me, we just changed our name to MyQuillo. I've got to catch myself on that. We're launching in November MyQuillo, which is designed for families, individuals with disabilities, and the teams of people that work around them. And it's all about building positive expectations on how they can explore, learn, and then connect with others to build that good life. One of the things we find is in this fast-paced world based on compliance, we're not building the relationships. We're not connecting with people around the key things that are important in their lives. We're doing a lot of paperwork, compliance regulations, reporting, but we're not really diving into what makes people happy, what makes them successful, both the person with the disability, but the staff that are working with them. And so we use micro learning, short 60-second videos delivered to the phone of the individual, the family, and do that in a way that builds their team with their staff, all with positive messaging about from our library of over 2,100 videos now.
Okay, wow. So are these videos then? You said you have a library of videos. So are these primarily being pulled from that library, or how does that? Well, maybe walk me through. Let's suppose I'm a DSP and I'm working in a residential setting, and so how's this happen? If it's in my organization, how would I be receiving this, or what's that
Great
like?
question. So you would be entering in, you're invited in under Quillo, MyQuillo, through a person you're supporting or their family, and about the issues that are most important to them. And you might get videos that are talking about things that he's done, things have coming up, things that are important to him. And it also has a wide variety of videos that are driven to your phone or you can search based on key topics. Like, I'd like to learn more about how do I help him be active? How do I help him be healthy? How do I get more engaged in the community? How do I take care of myself as a DSP as I'm dealing with all these issues going on in providing care to someone, and make sure that you as a professional are taking care of yourself along the same way. And it comes back to this idea about the building of relationships, something you asked in that first question. In this heightened area of regulation, um, let's talk about orientation when people get trained for the job.
Yeah, sure.
So many times your orientation may be as few as a couple of days, as long as a week. Maybe you shadow somebody on the job, maybe you don't. Maybe you meet people with disabilities during that orientation, maybe you don't. Every agency does it a little bit differently based on the rules in their state. I was talking to a group of DSPs the other day, and they spent a week in front of computers watching videos and taking tests. That was their orientation. Then when they got into the home, kind of all hell broke loose because it wasn't like what they were expecting. It wasn't what the video showed. And it was all about this idea of how do we build that relationship with the people you're going to be working with, the people you're going to be working to support, and how do you understand this role that you've stepped into as a DSP? And that changes with every person that you support. Uh, One of the things that I really encourage is bringing people with disabilities into the orientation and asking them, what do they expect from a DSP? What do they want in their life? One of our groups that does that, interestingly, told me that formed a question because one of the young men who was being supported, who has an intellectual disability, turned to the trainers and said, Nate, what do you want in your life? What's your good life? Now,
Hmm.
this is one of the young people just started working in this agency, and nobody had asked them that question. And so here is the person with a disability showing concern and saying, Nate, where do you want to go with your life? What's your good life look like?
What a moment.
And exactly. And when we look at the issues around turnover, we all know the results of what drives that. Its relationship with the supervisors, why people quit, the paperwork they're doing, and pay is third on the list. We're doing a project with NADSP. We just shared a piece now about NADSP, it's National Association of Direct Support Professionals, considers that roughly half of our DSPs qualify for SNAP benefits. Um, they don't make enough to fall above the guidelines. Now that's an indictment of our system, I think, right there.
Absolutely.
But as we think about that, how do we look at relationships between the people we support, the people that support them and their families? And our goal with Quillo is to how do we increase that communication? How do we make sure it's based on positive psychology of here's what we're hoping for our son and daughter. Here's what our dream for their future is. And here's what we hope from you. It's not about just call us if something goes wrong.
Okay. So are users then creating their own videos as well?
Yes. So say you and I are in a circle that I'm your staff person and my parents are in the circle. My brother who lives in Illinois is in the circle. My behavior consultant's in the circle. And something really cool happens. You can literally create a video on your phone, upload it to the circle, and say, we wanted to show you what John did today. This is something totally new. He tried painting and he loved painting. We want to explore more about how he can do painting because he really enjoyed it and he's good at it. That is something that doesn't have to go into a progress note that nobody will ever read.
Ain't that
It
the truth?
goes it goes into this conversation with the family or, "Hey, we went and did this at the store, and John said for the first time he'd really like to learn how to cook spaghetti. Has he ever cooked spaghetti before?" It's an instant way, and only those people that are part of that circle get to see that video. Or praise for someone that we have a young man that talked about he was only working with his behavior consultant. He was only told when he screwed up.
Mm,
Now, how long would your relationships last if the person you were talking to only told you when you screwed up? Not very long.
that's not a good experience. Yeah.
No, it isn't. And so his mother said, of course, let's think about this. And he said, don't I do anything right? And she said, we're going to start recording you all the things you do that are right. And then let's look at those and share those with folks. He started modeling his own good behavior
Mm.
by showing himself what he could do. And all of a sudden, everybody around him was encouraging him, not correcting him. And it changed the whole dynamic. So as we think about this, the goal of Quillo is not only to share new information you may not know about, or different techniques. One of my favorite ones that we do on exercise is called the couch pillow lift, where anybody can start exercise. You don't have to go run a mile. You don't have to go to the gym. You don't need fancy machines. This group out of Minnesota did 49 videos with us, a minute each, of different simple little exercises. And the couch pillow lift, anybody can do it, right?
Yeah.
You're just moving and you're stretching and it gets you moving and what we're doing. So the idea that how do we take this from a compliance of here's your plan Are you a sports fan, for example, Nate?
Absolutely, yes.
What's your favorite team?
Well, I'm in Pittsburgh, and I am all about black and gold. So Steelers, Penguins. Uh,
Well, I'm in Indianapolis, so we're not too fond of the Steelers right
this
now.
is
But
okay. A little
we
salty
played about as
subject because
bad as we could play. So hopefully we got all our mistakes out. But congratulations to you. But think about if somebody walked in your household, and it's now 8:45, and your program plan says it's time to go to bed at 8:45. TV is out. Well, it's in a moment of a critical game, and the staff walks up and just clicks off the TV.
yeah,
Not be good, right?
not a good situation.
Nobody is coming up to you and saying, "Hey, Nate, it's going a little bit long in the game. We got to get up at 7:30 in the morning. You okay with that? Everything okay? We can watch the game." Instead, the program plan says 8:45 TV is off. That's pretty darn institutional to me.
Yeah.
And we might have hell to pay if you turn off the game in the last 5 minutes. And so this idea that how do we teach people with short videos about how to be more person-centered, how to be more thoughtful of folks? This is for families. We have a whole series on, and we're going to be adding to this on dealing with people with early onset of dementia or Alzheimer's. If I walk into you and say, "Nate, I had lunch with the Pope yesterday." If you argue with me, we're heading for trouble.
Yeah.
If you say to me, "John, that had to be exciting. What did you have for lunch?" Let me answer. And then we say, "What would you like to have for lunch today?" You're not going to change my mind that I had lunch with the Pope. But the idea of how do we help people have a good experience? So with Quillo, our library is broken into a lot of topic areas that you can search. People can do it. And it's all about building those healthy and positive relationships with folks.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding it right, it sounds like it has kind of a component of almost like a closed closed circuit social media element where you can where people can post updates and things like this, but it's within that circle of trust or whatever, as opposed to just kind of blasting out to the whole public.
Yes,
And then, but then there's also a training component. And then also, well, like along those lines, I'm also hearing that an organization could use it for communication. Like you could scale communication where you're not going to necessarily want a text thread. Like if someone is oversees, manager oversees 10 houses and that represents 100 staff or something, they're not going to have 100.
absolutely
They
right.
don't have a
There's
text thread with 100 people on it. They're going to want to. They could use Quillo to kind of get a message out there for that too. Am I understanding this right?
Absolutely. It's got a lot of potential and powerful tools for it that you can use as little or as much. And when we talked the last time, and we both share this passion about culture, and I ask you a question here. When you look at culture of the organizations you work with, what is the most important factor in building a culture within an organization, do you think?
Quick announcement. If you're an executive or an HR director at a human services agency and you want a stronger, more stable workforce, I want to invite you to a new series of free live sessions designed just for you. I'm collaborating with the Institute on Community Integration from the University of Minnesota, and we're launching the Direct Support Leadership Lens Strategies for a Stronger Workforce series. These are practical, interactive, and they're anchored in that, yeah, we've already tried everything to fix it feeling that many leaders experience. You can get the whole scoop and register. Just click the top banner at iddleader.com.
The first thing that comes to my mind is actually a quote that I've repeated so many times it's a Henry Cloud quote, but he says, leadership is what I promote and what I allow. And that organizations that do a good job with culture, it sounds overly simplistic, but they really pay attention to what they're promoting, but also what they're allowing. And when that's
Yes.
done well, I think that what happens on Tuesday at 9:30 in the morning can be in line with what the goal on the mission statement on the wall is. And
Yes. And, I think it's what happens at 9 o'clock and 9:05 and 9:10 and 9:20, because I'll ask people, I don't care a whole lot for what's written on the wall. It's, um, What I care about is how watching people interact.
Hmm.
How do you treat the person that answers the phone? How do you treat the staff person that's having a bad day? I was listening to a fellow, Craig DeFacel is doing a great training, and he talked about, do you ever check in with your staff to see how they're doing?
Hmm.
How are they doing? You asked me a genuine question when we started, before we got started recording today, about how was I doing? I was able to share with you about my grandson who's ill and fighting pneumonia. And, your response was genuine concern. And that's real. How many times does somebody walk by somebody in an agency and say, Nate, how you doing? And you say, I just fell off the truck this morning and I got hurt. Oh, that's good. It's neither sincere or felt.
Sure.
And so I always say to folks, ask them a question. How much time do you spend working on the culture of your organization? And Quillo is all about helping you build a culture, which is ongoing. And everybody will say not enough. Well, how much time is that? Well, an hour or two a week. And they're thinking about a time that they sat and talked about culture. My
Hmm.
answer to them is every minute of every day, you're building the culture of your organization. Not by what you say, but by what you do. And
Yeah.
I like your thing about what you allow, because if you say one thing, but you don't, we're going to empower our staff, but you don't allow that because it's against the rules, or it might stretch the rule a little bit. A friend of mine told me about, he was talking to a young guy, and he works in job creation, support employment. And this young guy he was talking with, he said, I know you grow flowers. I'd like to learn how to grow flowers. And Joe said, I'll come over to the group home on Saturday. I'll bring some pots and some dirt, and we're going to plant some flowers, and I'll teach you how to take care of them. And so he showed up on Saturday. Now, he had not called the staff ahead of time and probably should have, but he gets there and they said, well, this is not appropriate because it's not written down in his plan.
Hmm.
So the staff didn't want to allow him in. And he said, well, what is written in his plan for today? Well, it's called relaxation time. And he said he's supposed to be in his room reading, watching TV, just relaxing. And the guy's now running out. He said, are we going to plant? Are we going to plant? And he said, planting flowers is relaxing. So they had to
Yeah.
have something that fit this artificial construct of a plan instead of saying, here's this wonderful experience. And he loved growing flowers in the backyard. So everybody, think about from that staff perspective, he's trained so much about compliance and following the schedule as
Yeah.
opposed to what makes people happy. A lot of the videos you'll find on Quillo, we ask that question, what brings you joy?
Hmm.
And rarely are people with disability asked that question. We often ask the staff, what brings you joy? And maybe there's an intersection there. Had these 3 women that were living in a residential program, and the 2 ladies were with them, and we asked that question about what brings you joy. And they said, well, I don't really know. This is 3 women with disabilities. And I guess watching TV or being with my friends. And then out of the blue, this young woman turned to one of the staff and said, what brings you joy? And she said, well, I would say it's singing in my church choir. And one of the young ladies said, could I come watch you? And she said, well, yes, I guess, if it's okay. And she said, but you need to know, that woman happened to be Black. And she said, our church services go from 10 to 2 o'clock, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. And we sing as many songs as the Spirit moves us. And you might be the only white face in the congregation. That's okay with us, but just want you to know. And the lady said, I just want to hear you sing. And she said, and you get to have lunch and dinner with us, at the church. So the other 2 ladies didn't want anything to do with this. So they went. She went and picked her up on her off time. This wasn't job related. Took her to church. They spent all Sunday there. And she said, can I come back next Sunday? And time goes on, they're having a great time, and the young woman says, "Could I sing in the choir?" And the lady said, "There's no requirement that you be good. You just have to be willing." And now she's singing in the choir. And she has a whole passion for her life that has nothing to do about her budget, compliance, or the rules in the home. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
And that's where
Absolutely.
joy is for everybody and
Yeah.
in the process.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. And how, I mean, what a great example, really, of helping someone create a good life, which is not simply in the often the confines that we put it in, or that we might think
Yeah.
of.
And it is so interesting. And I know your history is working in the area of behavior and looking at positive behavior and how do you change people's life. And that's such a key one because we tend to describe people in the terms of their past worst behavior. Something happened 8 years ago. Joe ran away 8 years ago. So we got to be worried about eloping. We don't know anything other than what we read in the folder. And I remember one time we did a video about this, about Eddie's yellow folder. And Eddie came back from a team meeting one time and he talked to me and he said, "John, I just went to a team meeting. Everybody's got a folder on me except me. And they won't let me look at what's in the folder." Now, how many times have we been in that situation?
Yeah. No,
So I
I mean,
called the executive director up and said, "Eddie wants to see his file." His parents were dead, so it was just Eddie on his own. And he said, "Well, we'll have to have a meeting, decide if we can let him look at his file." I said, "Wait a minute, it's his file. It's all about him. Of course he can see this." Well, they arranged for him to see it, and they said, "Well, he can't make any copies. He can just look at it." So I went with him, and his file's like 3.5 inches thick. And Eddie at the time was probably 50-some years old. Went back to when he was 14, and a high school guidance counselor wrote him up for something, and that was in his file in this. And again, he
wow.
said, "John, haven't I ever done anything good in all this time? Because everything in there was when he screwed up." And think about that. If you picked up any random file on somebody, how much good things would be in there versus every time he's been written up or screwed up or been diagnosed during that time?
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about here really is a paradigm shift, and
Absolutely.
I feel the tension of that as a behavior analyst, because generally, I mean, there's the science of behavior, but it generally kind of comes out of more of a pathology, a little bit. Not so much. Behavior analysts are trained not to assign a lot of value, like, oh, that's a bad behavior, but in general, the way that, like, even just the insurance is set up is like, what problem are you solving? And
Yes.
what are you doing to solve it? So even like the way the billing is set up, it it really encourages kind of that, like, let's look for the problem, let's see what's wrong and see what we can do about it, as opposed to looking at building skills or building a life that's worth living, or a good life. Yeah.
Well, I had a friend named Andy, and Andy did this all day. And so his behavior problem was to get him, to those that are listening, I'm hitting my head out with my right hand.
Okay. Yeah.
He didn't hit himself hard, but he just kind of did this nonstop
Yeah.
all day. Except if you were talking to him and you were engaging him, he quit doing it. So what did they do? They put him in a chair with arms on it, and they strapped his right hand down. Stopped him hitting. The goal was to stop him hitting his forehead with his right hand. Guess what he started doing?
His left. This
I'm
is
now hitting
okay.
my head with my
Oh my
left
gosh.
hand.
This is like Adventures in Missing the Point. Okay, this
Yes.
story. Okay.
So the idea is, the
Oh,
question is, how do we engage people? How do we find things that make them happy and do more of what makes them happy and less of what they don't like? And sometimes people don't speak, so it's a little more challenging for us
yeah.
to figure that out. But there are some wonderful new people stretching the envelope and figuring out what we can do. I was reminded the other day, they were talking to me about a fellow they were serving, and he would lay down on the floor and kind of get in a fetal position when he was angry. He didn't hurt anybody, he didn't strike out, did anything. And everybody would stand over him and try to pull him up, which was just totally wrong. And I went back to some training that I was able to be part of. Again, I'm ancient, but in the 80s, a guy named John McGee out of Omaha started this idea called gentle teaching. And so he would say, if you're laying on the floor, your person you're supporting is laying on the floor, you don't lord over them. Think about that position of power,
Yeah.
that somebody's standing over you. And he said, you get down on the floor with them
Yeah.
and you just lay them next to them for a while. Don't make them get up. Just let them know you're there with them. You want to be with them. And so many of the time we forget that we want to be with people. They're not furniture we're moving around. They're people. And how do we figure that out and find that way to connect with them? And what we do with that is simple little stories and share that. My friend Ben Drew did from Open Future Learning, a wonderful training resource. If people aren't aware of it, it's a terrific one. And he did some videos for us. There's one favorite one that people like is this DSP is coming on and she says, I had a terrible week. I just had a terrible week. I deserve this big piece of pizza. And she's got a big slice. And then a young man with a disability comes in and says, I had a terrible week too, picks up a big slice and says, I deserve a piece of pizza too. And the staff person takes it away and says, no, your behavior plan says you don't get pizza unless you have a good week. Now think of the irony of that, right?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness.
And so how do we transform this world we live in now that is very much a culture of compliance and control into one that turns people around and listens to them? Great agency in Tennessee called Core Services. It's done some great work with technology, a great work with having people having say in their lives.
Yeah.
How important it is to have say in your life, as
And
opposed
they've
to
been on the show, so actually, I don't know if the listeners have gone back that far in the catalog.
No, I
but
haven't. So
they've been on this show, so yes, I'm familiar. Yes.
wonderful people, and
Oh,
they
amazing. Yeah.
transform people's lives. And I think that's where we've got to go. And regulators have to give us space to allow, again, this is your line about leadership and what you allow is so important for people in state agencies, because sometimes we say the right things, but then we don't allow them to happen. And so how do we take that risk with people and not abuse that along the way? I mean, does that make sense?
Well, yeah. No,
Because I
it
think,
makes sense.
in
Now,
our small part of the world, we're trying to form ideas for families. I did a focus group with some providers the other day, and it was interesting. I asked them for one word that describes the mood of families right now. And I got two answers. One was unanswered. They're asking questions that nobody can answer. Not because they don't want to answer them, but there's so much uncertainty in the world, they don't know what to say back to them. The second one was overwhelmed. And we're at the same time we're making cuts and changing programs, we're putting more back on families. There's perhaps less likelihood you're going to get into a 24-hour supports that your son or daughter might need because of budget constraints. And so what do we do differently? What do we think about, not just going back to what we've always done, but what is it we need to do? So on Quillo, we try to explore different models like shared living. How do we make that real for people, that instead of this constant parade of DSPs coming through on a shift model, why don't we look at true shared living and when done right can have lifelong relationships with people?
100% on that. Yeah. And I recently talked with Dr. Mike Strauss out at Kansas, and he was on the show and he shared about it. They've been like really pushing that shared living model for a long time at their agency, and it has 3% turnover per
Yes.
year, and it has the most so it's extremely stable, and then the outcomes for individuals that are in it, because it's, I mean, talking about individualized care, or individualized, not just care like coming at you in a top over way, but I mean, it's like you're part of a family, and you just
Absolutely.
get to live your life with just the right amounts of support, but not more than what's needed. And it's
And the family gets paid more than they would as a DSP working. They're asked more, but it in many times can be tax-free along the way, but it takes a risk for states to do this. I was working with one state. They've had it as a goal for many years to do shared living. It's never taken off because nobody has time to develop it. And if you look at states that have done it well, they spend a lot of time developing the match between the person with the disability and the family or the individual. Um, Went out and visited a program in Pennsylvania that my friend Nancy Thaler, former commissioner in Pennsylvania of DD Services, her son is in shared living, and his current partner, they've lived together for 14 years. Now, they just went to some Caribbean island last year, and they got caught up, and they loved the visiting there, and so they bought a timeshare. And her mother said, "I wish you'd asked us before you did that." Well, two young guys, they decided they're sharing a timeshare because they love going there. Now, that's commitment. Now, what'll happen in the future, who knows? But they don't see themselves going somewhere else. And another young man that took in a fellow that had been just in tough spots all over, been kicked out about every program he had for being violent. And this one young man, David, said, "Well, he's never been violent with me. How about if we went and lived together?" They did really well. It wasn't magic, but it was darn close. Well, then he developed a relationship with a young lady and said, you need to know that this young man comes with me. We're a package deal. And she said, "I'm cool with that." So they got married, and it's now the three of them living together. So if we look for permanence and interdependence, not independence, none of us is totally independent.
sure.
We depend on other people, whether for emotionally, financially, physically. One of our guys did a video for us, and he said, "John, every time I hear the word independent, people want to make me more independent. You know what I hear? I hear alone. They want me to live alone in my own apartment. They want me to work with strangers that I don't know, that I don't know if they're nice people or not. And so I'm alone at work." And so a simple little message like that maybe stops a professional and says, "Boy, what am I doing to people by continually pushing them for independence when we all need friends? We all need connections." I just saw a piece that on LinkedIn where a group is trying to study social isolation for people with autism.
Yeah.
And they wanted to interview people. And how do we battle social isolation? It comes through friends that aren't paid to be around you. And where do you find those friends? I have a young man we're trying to help now who loves Star Wars. Doesn't like being around most people, but we're trying to find a group of people that love Star Wars that would let him hang with him.
Yeah.
And he's got some kind of interesting little habits, but probably no more so than a lot of the Star Wars, fans I know. But we can transcend some of that, right? If we're clever. But that isn't always written into the regs and the compliance and the pieces around that.
So what do you think this looks like then when it comes to how supervisors are interacting with, like, let's say frontline supervisors are interacting with their staff? This
So
whole
the
idea of,
first thing,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So this first thing is, where do frontline supervisors come from? They're generally they've been moved up. They've
Absolutely.
gotten a raise. Generally not a big raise, but they now have responsibility, and they've got to do scheduling, and they were part of the team, and they're not part of the team anymore. And they what is their metric they're guided on? Is it compliance? no serious incidents, nobody gets hurt, nobody gets called into by the police? Or is it based on a growth model? How are people doing? Are they happy? Are they building that out? And so I think the revelation has to come that we've got to change the paradigm throughout the organizations. That how do we do this differently? How do we spend money the most wisely to achieve what we want to get done? And do that at a time where right now, you and I are talking about how do we transform the organization to be more person-centered, more around the individual and what we do. And we have forces at work that want to return to large congregate settings, saying we can do it cheaper. Because some of our spending they point to on HCBS and saying, gee, you're spending $250 a day on a person. We could do it for $150. And we've got this nursing home that will convert and put 125 people in there, and they'll be happy. Well, we know it doesn't work. We know it's not economically viable. And while it sounds real seductive to people, it's absolutely turning the clock back instead of moving the clock forward. And so I think what we've got to do in this time of great chaos and change, when people say it's unanswerable, we have to start conversations about what is our new answer? What is our best idea going forward? Because it isn't just doing, I believe, more of what we've always been doing, but what is our next big idea? What is the thing that will unlock the potential of folks and their true joy in the community for what they're doing, and figure that out? Now, we've got some people doing interesting things of planned communities of 20, 30, 50, 150 homes in a neighborhood. I just heard one that was talking about in Florida building 500 homes in a neighborhood that would just be for people with autism. Um, some people think that's their new answer. I want to have an open mind. I want to listen to that. I do worry about creating communities that are all people that are on the spectrum, that you want to have 150 people living together in one neighborhood. And where do the relationships come? And those are people that are generally um, probably much more adept and working or doing things. I don't know. But what are our next new ideas that we really dream about? What would be better than what we're doing right now? And I think DSPs have answers for that. I think families have answers for that. And certainly people with disabilities have answers. And we got to figure out how to have those conversations.
Yeah, I completely agree that there's a little bit that does raise a little bit of a red flag of like that in some ways sounds almost like moving backwards. Um,
Well,
but
and I
I
get
mean
it.
maybe it wouldn't have to be, but
Well, the advocates of this will say, well, retirees all move in together and live together. Um, and I worry again, we some of these movements are based on people having resources, families that have resources that can buy a house, can build a house, and they like the idea of permanence. And part of that is driven by some of the impermanence in lives of staff turnover, trying to
sure.
find an apartment. You look in Indianapolis now, a 2-bedroom apartment, I was told the other day, the average 2-bedroom apartment is $1,800 a month. Um, that's a lot.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, and we're not a big city like Chicago or New York or Pittsburgh even probably, and so we're looking at this and saying, okay, what do we do? I was reading a report about affordable housing they were building in Chicago, and each unit of affordable housing costs $1 million to build. To me, that's not affordable
That's
housing, you know.
that sounds a little
So
yeah, sounds real affordable.
yeah. So I mean, the idea here is what is our answer? Indiana, we spend probably $1.6 billion on waiver services a year. And we have people we can't serve. And we have people that are probably getting over-resourced and some that are getting under-resourced. And how do we find the balance for that along the way of where do we want to go? And I think those are the interesting questions. And at Quill, we want to help people start thinking about that, because the answers are going to bubble up from the bottom, not so much be given down to us from on high, because it's people like yourself working with individuals that say, why don't we do this? Why don't we try something different?
Mhm.
We learned some things in the pandemic. We couldn't have 8 people living together in a group home in some places. So we had Nate. You get along really well with Sam. Could Sam come live with you? We're going to double your pay. You take care of him. And it's kind of a shared living model. And let's see how it works. You made twice as much money. Sam moved in with you. It turned out really well, worked well for a year. When the pandemic is over, guess what we did? We didn't say, hey, this was cheaper than the group home. Your life was better. Sam's life was better. We want to keep this going? No, we said it's time to move back to the group home with the other 7 guys.
Yeah.
So I think we've got to find out new answers in ways that make sense, that out of all this chaos that we're experiencing right now, what can we do that creates change, that changes this culture from one of compliance to one that is based on success, joy, and having friends that make life meaningful for folks.
Wow, a lot of outstanding takeaways from what John just shared. And I can't wait till next week when we release the second half of this interview. Now, I always try to leave you with some kind of an action item. And I guess a very simple one that comes to mind from this conversation would be to encourage you and to have you encourage all of your team and all of your staff to be doing this. Ask, what brings you joy? One little question. Start a meeting with it. Have a conversation in the hallway. Slow down for a moment to connect person to person. It's amazing what a difference that can make. And you heard it here. I'm officially giving you permission to be a couple minutes late or to push the pause button on whatever important task there is for you to do to make that kind of a connection with somebody, especially somebody that maybe you don't normally talk to that's at your organization. What brings you joy? Now, I also want to leave you with a tool that you can pick up for free. It is the 7 quiet danger signs your supervisors are burning out their teams. Listen, a lot of times burnout doesn't just announce itself. It sort of creeps in quietly with different practices. And this is a tool that gives a simple assessment that you can kind of see how this is affecting or might be affecting your organization. And then it gives you, of course, what to do about it. So I'm not just going to leave you there in the mess. Obviously, that wouldn't be very cool. So if you want to pick it up, you can do so at iddleader.com/burnout. And also, if this episode was helpful to you, I'm sure that there's a colleague or a friend that would benefit from it as well. And I just would encourage you to consider texting it or emailing it to somebody so they can check it out and learn from John as well. All right. Well, until next time, keep up the amazing work.